Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Joachim is a professor at NYU and a founder of TerreForm. He thinks very deeply about how we can think about urban design, about systems design in sustainable ways, and integrate that back into the cityscape. He will share with us a number of the fascinating projects that you have worked on and continue with this theme of the session.
Great, super great to be here. Thanks to Ryan and Kent and the group that put this together. So I have a nonprofit 501c3 organization in Brooklyn, New York, where we think about cities and automation and kind of anything that goes into them at multiple scales simultaneously. And we produce these kinds of visions or projects. Some of them are meant to be propaganda pieces, some are meant to be realistic, some are meant to be absolute unfeasibility studies, but everything is meant to look at holistic views of cities together and do that from the top down and from the inverse and from the middle out and what have you. And what you see here is a kind of a concept for a salubrious New York. You can see the Chrysler Building in the background. And here we have a city where we replace the streets with a riparian corridor that feeds all different types of aqueous life forms. We have automated systems such as multi-axis arms that till soil and harvest food. We have vertical farms or smart farms alongside the building facades. We've got vertical axis wind turbines and solar panels built into buildings. Light rail replaces most of the vehicles, and the city is meant to privilege the best interface, I think, which is the foot or walkability. And there's precedence for this. It's not something that just was born in a vacuum. There's actually hundreds of years or 100 years of dialogue since 1908 thinking about how we can look in this kind of combinatorial level at cities where we design everything from the systems that we move around in to the buildings themselves. So here in King's Dream of New York, Harry Pettit in 1908 is thinking about structures that are bridged and connected to elevator cores, cannionated systems for freight delivery and for horses, areas for slow-mo transportation or fast speeding systems, and then dirigibles that dock into ports at skyscrapers, et cetera. And then other concepts moving from into the 20s here by Raymond Hood are thinking about mobility combined with the architecture. So here are many bridges in New York City, like the Brooklyn Bridge, built with housing systems above and inside and around them. So as you move, you also live. And that this was taken to the kind of hyper extent where the thought was every 25 blocks or so, we'd have another bridge that would have housing and mobility, and then central clusters where we'd have peaks of density and people living in this kind of variant of Manhattan. And then getting into the 60s, we have concepts here by Jellicoe, which is called Motopia. And this is the reversal of the figure ground, where we take the streets out completely, replace them with buildings, take a lot of the bits that move us about, put them on top of buildings, have people live underneath, and where buildings used to be, we have all kinds of productive green spaces and parks. Then other thoughts here in the 70s, this is Paul Rudolph's scheme for the Lower Manhattan Expressway. This was a concept where autonomous vehicles would be underneath, light rail systems also on spines. We'd have inclined housing blocks that would be canted for the most amount of light and air and views, and they too would move along the spines of these major pieces of infrastructure. And then, of course, concepts, I think, that think about the future, like Minority Report, where we have vehicles that are omnidirectional, that stick to surfaces, that are magnetically controlled, transelvator systems that also connect to the vehicles and drive you directly from infrastructure into your apartment. And then concepts like this that we were doing, which is trying to look at the most ecological, if not extreme green version of some of these variants of living in the near future. So this is a technology that's 2,500 years old. It's called pleaching, or grafting inosculate matter together using computational control. And you make essentially these ivy-covered footballs that are in tune with the local metabolism and ecosystem and live inside these homes that are essentially trees and also alive. And then, of course, the bicycles, there's opportunity there to grow them from bamboo, et cetera. But this is a view of sprawl in the suburbs where it's a positive contribution to the environment, not something that's an efficiency model, which means less bad, or something where it's a zero model, like do nothing, like Switzerland. But this is something that's actually contributing to the atmosphere and accountable for 100 years of pollution, et cetera. So these are the problems that we face. all the time. It's the American value system. It's Donald Trump, who might get elected. And these are some of the thoughts that many Americans have. Maybe not the ones in this room, but there are at least 40-something% of us that are all about eating anything without consequence, let the scientists figure it out, driving the biggest possible vehicle we can imagine, and of course, having homes as large as possible because it's somehow a right, or something Jefferson said. This is some of the reality, which is the energy use and the transportation energy. And I think one of the biggest numbers there is we expect to double the amount of transportation energy within the next 50 years or so, and that's across the board in the United States. And this is from the US Congressional Budget Office and the Department of Energy. And then, of course, transportation energy in and of itself, a big number is thought of in this, or wasted on what we call circuity. That's roughly 20 to 45%. Now, circuity means driving around in New York City, spending 30 to 40 minutes looking for parking, or an 18-wheeler in Texas missing an off-ramp and has to go 20 minutes back and forth to get back into their direction. So getting smartness in these systems is absolutely crucial, especially when it comes to our concerns about the energy suck in our grid. These are other variants that we have been doing about the near future city, or maybe the far future city. So this was a project we had done for Popular Science magazine, and we had done this for Dubai. It's actually 2 days ago, it was announced that the jetpack systems that we had been promoting will be officially launched in Dubai as emergency service units, coming from a company called Martin Jetpack, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we were looking at this kind of holistic idea of cities where the vision was super crucial to put up front as a kind of a polemical piece to argue what it might be like, especially in forums like this, in the future. Do we need these kinds of things? What are the consequences? And we have to draw it up. We have to give it some level of visualization. Or we can write it up. I mean, if Jules Verne did not write From Earth to the Moon, the Apollo missions probably wouldn't have gone off the way they did. So here's some of the projects when I did my dissertation here at MIT in the Smart Cities group. I worked on future cars forever. These are concepts about soft cars, cars that are essentially have articulating frames or stand up, or the entire vehicle is inside the wheel, drivetrain, suspension, motoring. And you just add any kind of body you would like. The thing moves omnidirectionally on a surface. It's super easy to parallel park. The wheels talk to one another and also talk to other wheels in a context on the grid. The envelopes could be designed out of anything we're thinking of. It won't have to be sheet metal or these shiny, precious metal boxes we've seen since Henry Ford. Actually, think of soft materials inside there. So here's a system where there's an aperture point wherever the driver looks. It creates a window. Or the entire vehicle is transparent and soft, and it's got a visor that tracks solar income to avoid glare. You can also build inside it different kind of e-ink skins, et cetera, that project some level of social intelligence, such as we've reached 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, or if you're in New York, you might want to say something about the Red Sox. And then getting vehicles that were designed to fit very small footprints. So here's the smart car, and then here's our vehicle, or one of the many versions. This one actually stands up, and it's about 20% smaller than a smart car, especially when they interlock. Here you can see them interlocking together like shopping carts. They also can be fixed on those same systems. They'd be charged via renewables, either within city centers or actually just within a 100-mile radius from cities. And this is actually where car design became a chance to enhance, if not improve greatly, our antiquated infrastructure when it comes to energy. So these are very big batteries on wheels that can absorb peak demand and redistribute charge on the fly. And then taking these same projects with TerreForm 1, our organization, and going to Shanghai and producing some of these stackable vehicles that do a lot of these same systems with dedicated paths for movement, but sharing the sidewalk with folks. Here, they don't need to go faster than 30 miles an hour. And then ideas of systems that actually can grab on to armature devices and move freight or passengers up vertically, integrating into buildings. And actually, it's certainly possible to do. So this is a kind of a precursor to the Minority Report systems that you saw. So here they are moving up the side of a building and then integrating into elevator cores, and then elevators coming out and moving into other buildings. So it's a kind of a type of urban design where the architect doesn't accept the limitations of the automobile. The architect actually designs the automobile, and the automobile designer can think about the environment or the ecology, and ecologists can think about designing cities. It's really switching hats habits constantly and doing all these things from different filters of reason. So another version of this vehicle is called the shoe car. This was a sponsor, I guess, by Reebok, who came in, want to make the envelopes for these vehicles and attach them to the wheels. And this is one of those versions where you have a very sexy zipper to get in and out of these kinds of shoe cars that make all the envelopes. And it's okay to scuff shoes. In fact, over time, that's kind of the point. And then other versions of kind of the magic carpet, which the car is super lightweight as possible on these omnidirectional robotically controlled wheels, and the whole thing folds up and is incredibly easy to store. I think 80% of the time vehicles aren't moving anyway, so we got to think of the storage first and foremost. And then thinking of the car as being just essentially an air bladder within an air bladder, or a series of ETFE foil quilts that are super lightweight attached to these wheels, and then the seating systems are also air bladders that offer multiple points of protection. This is where we came up with the Hug and Kiss Lamb car. This is the softest possible vehicle you can imagine. It's meant to move in streets together in intelligent flocks and herds of vehicles. It bumps up to other cars. You can look at the, in the eye of the person next to you and say ciao, whatever you want to do. It's super lightweight. If it hits your sister, it would tickle her, it wouldn't kill her. You can tune it by adding helium to make it even lighter. And then you move in this kind of flow of gentle congestion in this stream of vehicles that are very dense, compact, but super soft and slow. And I think that's a vehicle designed for cities. It's not cities designed around the 20th century automobile, but it's a technology of mobility that fits inside the cities that we have today. And then here's how you'd probably phase it into the system. You'd have these precious metal boxes like Hummers taking over the road, but these sheep cars that are super smart and linked and omnidirectional and talking to one another would find that Hummer, cluster around it, and push it off the side of the road as they take over the streets. And other projects like this one, here's a fantasy of the Thanksgiving Day Parade by Macy's every single day in New York. And this is the thought that we take low-flying dirigibles at around 13, 15 miles an hour and harness that energy of 40 people holding these things down and have these ski lift-like tendrils with chairs on the end of them, and you hop on, you hop off, and you go your distance for 40 blocks, and someone else gets on these types of vehicles. They're controlled by funiculars. They can occasionally hit the side of a building, but they're super soft. It's totally okay. And they're also powered by similar blades to the turbine systems that we saw there. And then all of these things and an idea of what that future city might be. And I call it kind of soft mobs and smart dots. And here these systems are working together in tandem. Some would be phased out. Some might never come to be. And then ideas of what I think the real future is going to be about, which is essentially mostly walkable cities, the pedestrian and the bicycle, which is a fantastic technology. So we might not need all these other kind of soft bits. But putting in the smart dots, which is we need a sort of a contextual system that's talking to the vehicle systems and is also able to sense at a multi-level tiered scale things that might be walking in the street or might be a part of the street, like a little girl throws a ball in the middle of this kind of an intersection and must detect it, read it, and respond. And then other thoughts about human power. So a lot of these things don't have to be battery controlled, especially if you're in places like Boston or New York. This is another rail-based system for recumbent bikes. Lying down, it's okay for elderly folks to use these things. They're actually really comfortable to drive around in. They're dangerous on a New York City street because you're too low behind vehicles and you need a stupid flag to let people know that you're there, which becomes a target for some taxis. But here the idea is that you'd have a rail system above and below, multi-access planes where you'd have fairings on these recumbent bikes and they move all by human power. Not a new concept. Schweeb has been doing this here and they've got a really interesting system in place that certainly works. And then other ideas about human power. This is called the New York City River Gym. This is the idea that when you're working out and staring at yourself in a mirror, that might not be any good. Perhaps you want a better view. And at the same time, that energy gets translated and trickles down into a battery that helps propel these boats on a loop between Brooklyn and New York and Brooklyn and New York. And you can get off to a locker room wherever you would like. And then thoughts about the jetpack. So jetpacks are certainly here. We kind of know that. I would think that jetpacks need to be fully autonomous. They also need to be designed for multiple passengers to travel in them, or at least one passenger and room for storage and protection from the weather or the elements. You can go from I guess Kendall to Copley in less than 3 minutes in a jetpack, also with the similar turbine systems you find in many of the drones. And I think there'd be no control in something like this. In fact, I wouldn't want my mother flying around one of these things with any kind of control. It would be automated. It would fly direct. But if all hell broke loose, there's a red button, and inside your crotch there's a parachute, and you would be able to kind of escape. This is the ones that are going into Dubai. These are the ones you can buy for around $130,000 by Martin Jetpack. They would also be able to move in clusters and go from city center to city center as they attach to one another. And this is the very low-tech version. I subscribe to Aerospace Magazine. This is a sport called cluster ballooning. Very difficult flight control for this guy, but it's definitely the low-tech version of it. And the last things I'll kind of show are ideas about this new suburbs and the smart grid integrated into our massive American highway system, whatever that might be. So here's an idea that we can think of the biggest possible SUVs that would suck up the most amount of energy. Within 2 years, we'd achieve peak oil, and then we can get into a completely renewable grid system that's all about electric. And everything alongside the spines of these highways, and this is clearly an unfeasibility study if you haven't figured that out. Everything alongside those highways would deal with waste, food, water, energy, air quality, et cetera. I originally named them the kind of the Sarah Palin SUVs, the kind of the I-Wagon. You take your McMansion and you move in these kind of herds of cars that escape things like immigrants and whatever they, abortion or something like that. You might want to go to Colorado and hang out there. And then this is all built on this infrastructure that deals with everything as possible that would be renewable. So we'd move from one terrible carbon economic system into one that's radically changed. Built in this system into a very detailed model of how this highway would move from city center to city center. Looked at kind of different models of how these houses would move in different forms. This is an idea of a house party where you can hang out for many hours and do whatever you want to your neighbor, and then drive away at 4 in the morning, and more of these. And this is not finished yet, but it's being called the People of Connecticut, and then we'll get to that soon enough. And the kind of final project is we also do a lot of things that I can't get to, not just mobility, but these are smart farms that are completely mobile. They're rotegrity structures that are all flat packed and robotically milled. They assemble into this shape, and you can grow your food on the exterior. It's got sub-irrigation systems, 9 columns of it, that feed different plants. You can grow arugula, tomatoes, whatever you would like. And on the inside, you can grow anything, mushrooms, or you can actually hang out and be at one with nature and these kinds of things. They wheel around, they move to get more solar income, and they also have artificial lights to deal with things in the bottom of the sphere. Anyway, that's a really quick review of some of the work that we're doing. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Mitch, absolutely fantastic. I wish I'd met you earlier, and certainly we want to bring you to Berlin. We work on some very similar issues, so that's fantastic. Thank you very much. I now want to introduce our moderator for the session, but I also want to take this opportunity to thank you, Ryan, for putting this together, for hosting us, for being a really wonderful person all around, and it's been wonderful to work with you for these last few years.
Great, thank you. I'd like to call upon Raf and Mitch to come back up, please. And Florian, too, at the end, please. Well, Mitch, you never disappoint. Mitch was one of the first students that we had interviewed to work with us on the CityCar project. And the interview was, we really don't want that guy on our team. And because he really did not want to do anything to do at all with what we were trying to do. And then Bill Mitchell said to me, oh, put this guy in this pile over here. And about 6 months later, he became the biggest advocate. So you can see where this kind of need for orthogonal thinking is really needed for creativity and for disruption. It was certainly disruptive to our interview process. And
I knew nothing about car design, man.
right,
It's like
exactly, exactly. So one of the
landscape
questions
urbanism. It's like-
that I have is, we've had in this whole summit this question of technology, economics, policy. What is the role of design? And what I mean by that is design with a capital D, meaning the profession itself, not just product design, not just architectural design, but the profession itself. What is the role of design in designing the world that we have, as opposed to being subcontracted by some other group around some other mission? What is that role of design?
Let's start.
Yeah, I think design is absolutely crucial. In fact, I think it's one of the most powerful tools humans have. It's the power of the imagination. And I think that when it's used for forces of good, I think it leads to almost anything you would want. I think without these kinds of upfront abstractions and kind of dialoguing in the forms of models or visualizations or what have you, making things and kind of screwing up things and making them again, you create this incredible feedback with the people that you're working with, or even yourself, or what have you, and it leads down to these kinds of new territories of discovery, and it's the base core of exploration. And I think that really most projects start with design. Most things are designed, at least the really good things. And I would think the big mistake was to think that it's something that happens at the end of the pipe. That, a bunch of engineers worked on something, there was no designer involved, or that engineers are not designers, and that at the end the solution is trying to capture or house something that's has totally nothing to do with design, and that becomes a sort of a big problem. But design it's very natural for disruption and design to be together. In fact, I think they're not juxtaposed. It's actually a tool of design is disruption. We probably didn't call it that to more recently, but it's certainly a part of what we do. Right.
So I agree. I also think that you can't take either extreme view. You can't view design as something you bring in at the end to pretty up your product, but you also can't take the view that designers think things and then they solicit help from technologists to make their things come true, because as was mentioned, a lot of the process of design is just to really explore the space, and most of the things are not feasible. But that's okay, because that's the end result is not the things that are proposed, but it's the process and just making people think, hey, this is possible, let's explore where it goes in the other direction. I think you get the most power when you combine these things together right from the beginning, when you get folks that are that are technologists, that are engineers, that have a product that they need to make, but also work alongside from the beginning, even before the knowledge of what the product is going to be, so that they can work together. I mean, at Kiva, we had a strong influence in design. Our vehicles where there were a lot of constraints on how they should look and how they should make people react to them. There's a lot of knockoffs now, a lot of Kiva knockoffs, and a lot of people mentioned to me, what's your opinion about these Kiva knockoffs? They're not. We look at their specs; they don't go as fast as your machines, and they can't lift as much. But that's never my initial reaction. My initial reaction is they look like crap compared to our machines. If you look at our robots, they look way better than theirs, and that was very instrumental in having people accept them. We didn't know ahead of time how people would react to these robots. The pick workers, were they going to, sabotage them? Were they going to rebel against having these machines alongside of them? But actually the opposite happened. They were very engaged by them. They gave them names. And I think part of it was the fact that they were designed to coexist with people.
Yeah, I see that now in electric vehicle design, for example. You've seen in the past, especially if you take the Tesla, the initial Tesla was actually a Lotus that was converted. And I actually call that almost like a transvestite vehicle, right? You're sort of extracting out and putting in a new kind of, it's a dramatic change. It's a surgery kind of thing. So now you're starting to look at vehicles that are coming from the ground up, right? They're designed with an intention, and now they're kind of retrofit. So how do you see this kind of design intention being part of the design process? It's sort of, there is some intention, but at the same time, there is exploration too.
Yeah, I mean, intention is the first signal of whatever it is you're designing, and falls into a lot of your principles on what you want to make. And the idea to question big problems or grand challenges comes at that point. You want to design a vehicle where no one ever dies in a car accident again. This might be against maybe a kind of a corporate logic, or might not fit into a kind of a scale of economy to be sold someplace, but at least you could start off with this as an intention and design from that platform down. I think it's also, I want to say this before, important to remember that a lot of design has been associated with ego, and I think that's the previous generation. I think design, great design, or even good design happens in incredible teams today. That's basically it. We call ourselves TerreForm because it doesn't privilege any one person. And we do work in this kind of argumentative place where we get to a better solution. But I had this talk with Philippe Starck, who was like, the previous generation designer. And he's awesome. He does incredible juicers and things like that. And he recently made a gold-plated AK-47 machine gun with a light bulb on top that became this lamp that sells for around, 8,000 euros. And this came from a decade, or I'd say decades, of designers that really didn't represent a lot of these grand challenges that were faced. Their principles were mostly about aesthetics and thinking about what really becomes super beautiful and what becomes a signature object, just like the Stata Center, which is a building I love. I worked for Frank Gehry. Or IMP, who did the other building there, I also worked for him. These are fabulous pieces of architecture, but they weren't really always trying to address some of the grand challenges. I think design is actually capable now, especially now, to be a part of what's happening in our society, what's happening in our world, and offer kind of a vision or a viewpoint and a real alternative, or even a set of alternatives, so that we can get to a better place. Firemen and teachers and gymnasts don't have time to visualize tomorrow. So someone's got to do these things, and hopefully their heart and minds are in the right place.
So there's this new term that's been bantered around. We've been using the word multidisciplinary, multidisciplinary particularly, but now what about this anti-disciplinary? That there are no sort of boundaries between designers, engineers, the firemen, and so forth. What is that? Is that needed? Is that needed?
I think you need some sort of compartmentalization, simply because at the end of the day, you got to make stuff, right? And somebody has to be responsible. That if I'm going to fly on a jetpack, I want to make sure that the folks that did the control systems design are experts in control systems, and that it wasn't some guy that came in late at night and said, "Hey, let me give a go at this." Having said that, I think we have to make sure that that folks speak with each other about the whole thing that they're trying to create, and not just their little piece. So it's just like everything else. I think the right thing to do is usually somewhere in the middle. I think both extremes are not viable.
Florian, you have any questions?
Well, yeah, and I think this takes us into the whole question that design is not necessarily only design of physical objects. It can be design of cognitive space. And as we try and move away from this carbon-based economy, we also have to sort of lift ourselves out of that cognitive space, where, as an example, we accept certain notions of efficiency, which are essentially autistic. And we're justifying not moving into this post-fossil world by applying these notions of efficiency sometimes. So I think that requires also thinking about designing social space. I do agree that we need to get out of these silos of knowledge. Of course, we do need them to a certain extent. I would also agree with that. So I think that's a given. But I think also we have an opportunity to think of design as a didactic tool. We're about to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Bauhaus in Germany. And I think, again, we take some cues there from how to think about the relationship between form and function and bringing those things together. So I do think that design cuts across all these things. And it does mean that we have to free ourselves from some of those axiomatic self-enslavement that certain disciplines bring with them.
Okay, good. Well, let's open it up for some questions from the audience. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left. Any questions? Up here in the front.
Good. Again, great panel you got here. This is Jerry Tierney Perkinson. Will, using the term design, I want to go back to like the opening session when we were talking about what is the North Star. And you'd mentioned about sustainability, and other people had said it's really about people. And I want to bring us back to that, and it's not about products. That basically design has to be holistic. In other words, somebody has to take together this team that's going to be interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary, whatever we want to call it. What we want to do is take the silos from 40 feet to maybe 40 inches so we can step across between each of the silos. But why it's important, why the design profession needs to be in here, is that we need to talk about the space between the buildings in our cities, and that's all about the people. And I think if we improve that space between the buildings, sustainability will result from this. But you were having a discussion here that was largely talking about the products, but I want to talk about the space between the buildings. You were getting out of there, Joachim, with some of your studies of this. But really, we have to try and reclaim the public realm that used to exist prior to the automobile. Prior to 1914, basically how we interacted with the public realm was completely different from the way that we are now, where basically the automobile dominates and we're restricted to 6-foot wide sidewalks. We're like rats running around the baseboard of a room, whereas once upon a time we were able to walk around the room freely. Now we're confined to scurrying around the edges. And I'd like for you to kind of maybe review or comment upon that. Thank you.
So I'm not going to have too much to say about it because that's not my space, so maybe I'll speak first because then I'll do it briefly. Spend any time in Europe, you walk in Paris, they have wonderful big spaces, and this is an old city, so this is not an old concept, right? I think it's just modern cities have evolved to be very utilitarian, and fortunately, some of the older cities have retained this beauty. You walk in Paris, you walk down the main park area, and it's just incredible that all this open space is being maintained. But almost any European city has large piazzas and places where people congregate. I think we can look back at our history and try not to lose that.
Yeah, and I think just briefly to the point about people, I think people and sustainability is identical. So when we speak about sustainability, of course it has to be people-centric. We are biological beings. It also has to be centric to other living things around us. So I don't see any conflict between those two concepts, and that was what I was taking issue at in the first session yesterday. So I do completely agree, and I think Mitch has shown wonderfully how we can reinvent this public space. And I think that public space is both a virtual space, as a social space, and it is a physical space. And the design of public infrastructure, public digital infrastructure, is the next big challenge of how we design that, is absolutely key. And I couldn't agree more with you. The spaces in between is what matters.
I think just on as another architect and urban designer, we have to recognize at some point the very nature of our profession, its very definition, urban designer, is a bit flawed. We can absolutely control and author design, really at any scale, Newtonian to, whatever, the superorganism of the earth. So design part's there, but we can't necessarily control or author urbanity. And that's the difficult thing. I'm not interested in designing people's behaviors. There are people that might be interested in influencing them and creating environments that affect, et cetera, and are contextual. And I think that's super important. But people need to be as free as possible. So it's actually, we're always trying to design around ourselves and recognizing that ourselves are the core of the problem when it comes to sustainability. 11 billion people on this planet Earth by the next century. That's double Manhattan within 50 years. The resource extraction is enormous. The care for every other life form. We still haven't evolved to really have a kind of an idea of relating on a sentient level to plants and animals and everything else that's in there. We are designing in a very people-centered world, and you're totally right. Things need to be holistic. They need to be considered, and I just worry about what is actually authorable.
Last question, please. No.
Hi, I'm Matt Kaywood from Transit Screen. You mentioned public digital interfaces or architecture. Infrastructure, yeah. And I thought, some of these examples, of Mitchell's were brilliant, and I'm sure I missed his best slide because I was probably too busy tweeting about it. So, I think the question that I have is all this has been very focused on spaces and places and architecture and urban design. how do we cross the border to sort of, information design and interfaces and what's the relationship like that going to look like, specifically in the, mobility space or in the urban space?
Do you want me?
I think you showed some examples, really.
I'm happy to jump in. I think it's an absolutely key question. I think this goes to open data. This goes to if someone was mentioning we need data to flow like water, I would tend to agree. But we also need to make sure that it's accessible for everyone and it can be shared. And I think one of the biggest pieces in the mobility question right now is how we design the public digital infrastructure to support these innovations in the sharing, in the automation, and in some of these other technological solutions. So I would see that as also essential and probably one of the key battlefields for the next few years, also to understand how we maintain democracy in that digital infrastructure. So I'm very much right. We didn't focus on it perhaps too much in this session, but it's a key question.
Yes, I want to thank our panel. We're not going to take a break. We're going to go straight into the final talk. Susan Shaheen will be the speaker or the moderator and for that next session. Let's just thank our panel, Florian, Mitch, and Raf. Thank you.